Director of Communications for the Family Institute at Northwestern University. Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Family Institute, through research, education, and therapy, we practice relationship-based behavioral health care and are committed to strengthening and healing people from all walks of life. Today, we are proud to bring forth this discussion on how you can find effective strategies for navigating stress and anxiety and creating resilience within those things. For today's discussion, I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Alyssa Campbell and Ms. Daniela Van Pelt. First, to introduce Dr. Alyssa Campbell, Alyssa takes a compassionate and self-accepting approach to therapy. She empowers her clients to reach their goals and co-creates a safe space for them to reflect on their values and experiences. Alyssa also helps to create the change that they've identified as meaningful in their lives of her clients. We are also joined by Ms. Daniela Van Pelt. Hi, Daniela. Daniela is a bilingual therapist who is passionate about partnering with adults of all backgrounds. These adults typically struggle with anxiety-based and obsessive-compulsive disorders. Daniela uses a person-centered, affirming approach. She also uses a variety of therapy modalities to help her clients address their pain in their lives. She also helps her clients better connect with themselves and also others. Thank you both for joining us. To start our discussion, can you both talk about what are some misconceptions about stress that you've encountered in your practices?
Sure. Thank you so much, Crystal. Yeah, I guess I can start off with a couple. You know, one of the things that we can hear in sessions with clients is that all stress is bad. And while stress definitely can have, you know, different reactions, we can have different reactions to stress. At times, it can also be really beneficial for us. Temporarily helping us boost our performance, helping us sort of like rise to the occasion and be ready to adapt and meet the challenges that are at hand. It is sort of in this process of responding to our stress that helps us adapt and develop cognitive and emotional strategies for dealing with difficulties in the future.
I'd like to add to that, Alyssa, that the fight, flight, freeze response, which has been synonymous with that stress response, is meant to help us to respond quickly to imminent danger. And while a lot of the physiological responses that we feel when we're experiencing stress can feel pretty threatening or uncomfortable, it's meant to be adaptive, as you said.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that, you know, we can hear is like, I shouldn't be feeling stress if it's a positive experience or maybe something that I really value. What's actually happening is like stress can often come from things that we deem as positive, not just negative. Any change or event that disrupts our normal functioning can introduce stress into the system that we have to respond to. Even positive events like going on vacation or maybe even like starting a new job that you've been hoping for and working toward can be considered stressful because they do require a change in our daily routines and some reorganization, you know, of our daily lives and even kind of our mental and emotional selves. Another sort of myth that we can hear is that everyone's stress is supposed to look the same. And although we all have the capacity to feel stress, because congratulations, you know, you are human, you have that capability, the way that we all deal with stress is not universal. So the same experience that leads me to feeling stressed may not lead to you being stressed. And sort of said another way, like people can have different reactions to the same circumstances, and that's totally normal. What really matters here is that how you respond to your reactions to stress.
Yeah, and I think another common misconception that I hear is an underlying, I should do anything I can to avoid feeling stress. And while, yes, many of our stressors are problems that we're attempting to solve in our lives, sometimes living our lives in line with our values and our goals means engaging in things that may bring on stress. So some examples of that include having an honest but difficult conversation about our feelings, pursuing a challenge like higher education or a new job, or even some of the positive life events that Alyssa just described earlier. And if we were to avoid stress at all costs, we might miss out on some really valuable experiences.
And I guess to kind of piggyback off of that too, right? Like stress management, like just because we have stress management skills doesn't mean that we aren't going to be stressed at different times. Again, like stress is a normal part of life, something that we all experience. And if our goal was to have no stress, we'd likely be stressing ourselves out in pursuit of that goal. So instead, we kind of we want to refocus our efforts that we take to sort of manage the stressors in life of the things that we can't control, and then while developing strategies to manage the things that we cannot control.
That's a really great kind of framework for this discussion and really understanding how stress comes into your life. Can you talk about how does one differentiate between what might be considered healthy stress and harmful stress, and what are signs that people should be mindful of?
Sure. So I guess I would break it down in this way. Some stressors are normative and sort of predictable. This could look like maybe having a baby, retiring, there's a big project at work, something like that. It's pretty normal within our daily lives. Whereas other stressors are considered non-normative, such as the sudden death of a spouse or a loved one, a diagnosis of, an illness that you weren't expecting, any other unexpected life events. Additionally, some stressors can sort of be acute in nature, where there is sort of short term that could look like maybe planning a wedding, whereas other stressors can be long term and chronic, such as living with an abusive partner or perhaps dealing with ongoing race-related discrimination. Using that kind of framework, we want to be mindful of the intensity and the durations of the stressors. So for intensity, I like to think about things on a scale of like 1 to 10. If I'm anywhere, within the 1 to 5 range of stress, I likely have access to my coping skills and strategies, as well as access to my social supports. But a score of 6 or 10, 10 being kind of the most intense stress that we could ever feel, that might mean that my access to those supports and strategies, it's a little harder to do. Similarly, we want to think about the duration of our stress. So usually our stress symptoms will go away once the stressful situation has been alleviated. But if that's not happening, you might want to do some work to kind of understand sort of what's going on and how you're responding to those stressors.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, right, the multi-dimensional responses that we have to stress are meant to be helpful to manage the stressors, but they can also make it difficult to function if they get in the way of being present, sleeping, eating, connecting with others. So when it comes to evaluating whether the stress is healthy or unhealthy, I prefer to ask the question, is whether the situation is sustainable long-term. What can be sustainable for one person, like running a marathon or socializing with many people in one day, may not be sustainable for someone else. And that can help us to evaluate, okay, do I need to make some changes in what's going on to cause the stress?
Sure. And kind of similarly, like regardless of the source of stress, our bodies tend to be fairly predictable in how we cope with them. And so kind of thinking about what are our responses to stress, and is that within like our range of like normal sort of functioning and just living and relating to others, that might be a really good cue as to how Daniela characterized it as like, is this sustainable for me or is this unsustainable? And so we'll typically look at sort of different symptoms, like physical symptoms, such as perhaps an increased heart rate or prolonged muscle tension. You might have cognitive symptoms, such as difficulty concentrating or perhaps really intrusive thoughts. We can also have emotional symptoms in our response to stress, things like panic, fear, anxiety, or shame. And then we can also have some behavioral responses to stress. This might look like isolating yourself or having difficulties eating or sleeping, maybe increasing our alcohol intake, things like that. So you can sort of think about things, physical, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. And are those things within, again, like that range that you can sustain?
That's good. That's really, really great information. And thinking about how people deal with stress, thinking about resilience. Resilience is described as bouncing back from adversity. What techniques do you recommend for building that resilience?
Sure. So one of the things that my mind goes to in terms of building resilience really aligns with self-compassion. I believe that self-compassion is really an important part of building resilience. Dr. Kristen Neff sort of operationalized self-compassion as a way of turning toward ourselves in times of suffering that is characterized by increased kindness towards ourselves and reduced judgment, increased recognition of sort of like our common humanity, and decreased isolation, and then greater mindfulness and less over-identification with our thoughts. So Daniela sort of spoke about the fight, flight, and freeze response earlier. And I like to think about self-compassion as an act that we can do when we kind of have those urges to fight, flight, or freeze, that self-compassion can also be an act as a stress response. And in this way, it sort of flips our nervous system from that fight, flight, and freeze into what looks like more of a caregiving response. So self-compassion really allows us to stop and say, like, this is really hard right now. How can I stop and take care of myself in this moment? And so one of the ways, maybe one of the easier ways to cultivate self-compassion is sort of by asking yourself, like, what would I say to a friend who is going through something like this? What would I say to somebody who I really care about that is experiencing some of these same things or symptoms? So let me kind of break this down. First, in order to experience compassion, we have to actually notice in this instance that like our friend is suffering, our friend is feeling bad about themselves. And if our response is one of compassion rather than pity, you sort of understand that suffering, making mistake, or stress is part of our shared human experience, no matter where that source of stress is coming from. And finally, in that moment, you'd likely respond to your friend with sort of understanding, warmth, and care, and kindness that you'd really like to try to help them in some way, or just to kind of sit with them and let them feel heard and understood. So those components of self-compassion, again, are mindful attunement to what's going on, a sense of common humanity, and an orientation towards kindness. So the trick here is really like learning how to give yourself the same compassion as you give to a friend. And sort of within that whole kind of framework, really the ability to reframe and take a different perspective can be helpful in fostering resilience as well. So this idea of like, do we conceptualize an event as traumatic, or do we conceptualize it as an opportunity to learn and grow? Are we framing this adversity as a threat or a challenge, one that maybe we can rise to the occasion?
And I'd like to add to that, Alyssa. I think, right, stress and trauma can go hand in hand, and trauma certainly impacts how we see ourselves, others, in the world. It has an impact on our lens through which we view the world. And so our thinking about our lives and the events in our lives really does make a difference. And one of the questions I like to ask is, are we making predictions about how we'll be able to cope with a difficult event before even giving ourselves a chance?
That's a great question, I think, to ask ourselves. Just another kind of framing of resiliency. There's some researchers and collaborators at the University of Pennsylvania, and they've identified 6 resilience competencies that include, this idea of self-awareness, paying attention to yourself, self-regulation, the ability to change one's thoughts, one's feelings, and one's behaviors, mental agility, sort of this idea that we have the ability to look at situations from different perspectives, strengths of character, kind of honing in to what your resources are, what your strengths are, that you can use to sort of engage with and welcome challenges, helping you to create a life that is aligned with your values. Certainly connection is a competency when it comes to building and fostering resilience. That ability to build and maintain trusting and strong relationships. And sort of this idea of optimism, right? Like the ability to notice the positive, focus on those things that you can control, and then to use that information to take purposeful action.
That's really helpful. I really like what you said about self-compassion and about how you would talk to your friend. I think that just really gives an approachable way to think about how you can give yourself self-compassion. Kind of building off of that, how does self-care relate to stress management, and what are effective self-care practices that you would recommend?
That's a great question. I like to start off by defining self-care because it's been described a number of ways. Treating yourself, taking a long bath, lighting a candle. And I think all of these can be considered self-care, but we also include the self-care that it takes just to keep functioning, like getting enough sleep, getting enough to eat and drink, nourishing our relationships, getting enough movement. And sometimes we take these for granted and have a hard time connecting how not having those needs met can make our stress management that much harder. So what happens if you're having a hard time regularly tuning into your own body's needs? Frequently, there are emotional and cognitive barriers that can make it difficult for us to prioritize our own needs. We may be automatically ignoring our needs to prioritize the other demands in our lives. And this is unhelpful problem solving because it ultimately comes at the cost of like really important bodily needs, and we may suffer physically and emotionally as a result. I like to reference the approach that the authors of Burnout, a book on the stress cycle, have provided in terms of a way to reframe some of the thinking around our needs by posing the visualization. Imagine that your body is the body of someone who needs your care, like an infant, for example. So if we were to imagine this, we can then ask ourselves, how would I respond if these needs were coming from a child? And maybe a better question is, would we say, you don't deserve to rest, or go to the bathroom yet, or suck it up a little longer? So if you're willing to practice this visualization, ask yourself those questions, and would like a little more focus on what to look for when you're listening to your body's needs. Some of the needs that may arise when you're looking for them are maybe the need for rest or sleep, the need to move your body, to connect with somebody else, for nutrition or water, or even to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, and I guess I can add to that, Daniela, as you were talking. One, I need to purchase Burnout because it sounds like there's a lot of good information in there. But two, kind of this idea of cultivating routines for yourself, maintaining healthy routines for yourself. You know, what does that look like? Does it look like getting enough sleep? Does that look like making sure that you have avenues for social interaction throughout your week or throughout your month? Just these routines that can make us feel grounded, even when there are things that are out of our control. There are still routines that we can create and cultivate for ourselves that we can rely on and act toward. Yeah.
And thinking about external stressors and the environment, what are things like such as the workplace or your home settings that impact stress levels? And then how can individuals navigate or mitigate these stressors?
Sure. Yeah, the places where we spend a lot of time can have a tremendous impact on our well-being. That seems obvious, right? Our environments not only include the physical spaces that we're in, but also the people and the interactions that we have in those environments. In an ideal world, these environments would be supportive, uplifting, and kind. But for many people, we know that this isn't always the case. Instead, places like home can be sources of extreme stress due to those things that are outside of your control, right? For example, you know, experiencing discrimination and hate at the workplace, experiencing food insecurity or violence at home, or even perhaps living in an area with limited resources, or working in a place with a lack of social support, all of those things can have tremendous impacts on our mental health and well-being in like a negative or harmful way. And so it's important in these cases, I think, to remember that some of these causes of stress are beyond our control. And while it's not up to us to fix those things that are out of our control, we do have an accountability toward ourselves to try to manage our place in those spaces. And so one of the things that I think about how we can sort of take that accountability active step towards ourselves is to do this by setting boundaries. To be clear with others about what you can and can't take on, what is acceptable for you and what's not. Letting people know that and sort of maintaining those for yourself. And certainly, you know, asking for help is one of the most courageous things that we can do. It's sort of this like mutual process where you've identified your own needs and then have taken action to not be isolated in your experience, allowing others to either bring you in or help you out.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Alyssa, because I think, right, we recognize that there are many stressors that are just outside of our hands, from, right, the more like local community, you know, group stressors to even like systemic, like wide reaching stressors. And so I like the framework that's been developed by psychologist Dr. Ryan Delap to navigate culture-based stress that can help you develop two different goals. There's change goals and resilience goals. Change goals center around finding ways that you as an individual can change something about the current situation, such as through activism, seeking advocacy and asking for help in that way, and assertiveness in setting boundaries and expressing needs. Of course, all of these change goals require cost-benefit analysis to consider the social, safety, resource, and emotional costs. It's not free, which is also why I think resilience goals are important. And the resilience goals revolve around meaning making, reframing and discovering your agency in other ways, and enriching your own life in a variety of ways, like in your relationships, in your wellness, your achievement goals, practicing some creativity in what that looks like given the stressors that you're facing.
That's really helpful to think about, you know, these environments that influence our stress. And then thinking about, you know, they always say support systems, your family, your friends, like how do those social supports or community engagement, just involvement with other organizations, influence an individual's ability to cope with stress?
Great question. I mean, starting from the basics, connection with others is a biological need. It's just like our need for sleep, for food, for water. According to a study from 2015 that encompassed 70 different studies and over 3 million research participants from around the globe, it was found that social isolation and loneliness increased a person's odds of an early death by 25 to 30%, right? So we've outlined earlier how not having our needs met can make stress management that much more difficult, and in fact could become stressors themselves. Our need for connection is as a part of that formula here for making sure that our needs are met, because chronic loneliness has been, and lack of connection to others has been described as having the same impact on our mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Like, even though we don't suffer physically in the same way from chronic loneliness, if we were to deprive ourselves of food or water, it still has an impact on us physically.
Wow.
When you hear those statistics, it is, I think, brings home the point that like we are social creatures. We crave connection and we survive based on the connections that we make. You know, similarly, social support can really buffer some of the negative effects of stress. Things like emotional support, right? Like talking and listening to somebody, providing validation, empathy, and encouragement, reassurance that like things are going to be okay. Having somebody actively listen to you without judgment allows you to really express and process those difficult and stressful situations in sort of this like carrying dynamic between you and this other person. Social support can also provide us avenues for like informational support, things like advice giving, collaborative problem solving, and social support can also offer us like tangible support, right? If I need help with something and somebody's willing to help me out so that it frees up space for me to maybe, take some time for myself or tackle another issue that I'm dealing with, that seems to be something that social support can really help with. And I also think about a lot of the benefits of just being integrated in our communities and with others. This increases a feeling of belonging, which can really buffer against stress. This can also improve moods, right? If you're, sitting somewhere and laughing with somebody and connecting and telling stories about your lives, that's likely going to help increase your mood and maybe moving away from what is stressful. And then, of course, just engaging in social pursuits and activities with others, hobbies, can provide not only like a sense of distraction, but also a sense of enjoyment and relief from those stress symptoms as well. And, it's important to think about, right? Like in the same way that accepting help and support from somebody else, from those who care about us, can help strengthen our resilience. Assisting others in their time of need can also have a positive impact on you, your family, and community. Sort of calling back to what Daniela was talking about in terms of advocacy efforts, activism, right? Those efforts are an active stance that we get to take to, take care of ourselves and hopefully create a better world for all of us.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Alyssa. I think that our supportive relationships and our loved ones can help remind us of who we are and what we value when it might be difficult to remember on our own. So connecting with our communities may help to remind us that we're not alone in both our pain and our joy, which feels like it ties back to that common humanity that you brought up earlier.
Yeah, no, that is really great. I think just having that social support and, just helping with your stress and just really creating that community, and not only for yourself, but for others as well, is just so important. So you provided really great information about stress and how stress might come about and kind of what support looks like. Can you share some practical techniques or strategies that people can use to manage stress more effectively in their daily lives?
Yes, I think having some practical strategies to be able to bring into your day-to-day is so important. One disclaimer I will say is that while I think like these strategies are really helpful for most people, having an individualized plan that you've developed with a therapist is going to be the most effective, because you and the therapist are going to get to talk about kind of the root causes of things. But in the meantime, right, here are some things that can be helpful generally. One is relaxation strategies. There are studies that show that there's a lot of clinical evidence for the efficacy of relaxation therapy techniques, especially when applied to anxiety disorders. Why do they help? Right, using relaxation techniques helps to trigger the relaxation response, which is said to be the opposite of the physiological state that our bodies are in when we're experiencing stress or panic. And it can help the body generally be calmer, more in a more relaxed state generally. So even though scientists are still trying to learn exactly why deep relaxation is so effective, the idea is that it's much harder to have an anxious mind in a calm body. So one of my favorite deep relaxation strategies starts off with deep breathing, abdominal breathing. And one of my favorite techniques comes from the book, The Anxiety and Phobia Workbook, that describes how two of the most common pitfalls when it comes to deep breathing for folks who find, hey, you know what, this isn't helping me, is one, not breathing slowly enough, because when we find ourselves breathing too quickly, we find that we might actually end up hyperventilating, which adds to the symptoms of anxiety we might already be experiencing. And the other is not breathing for long enough. Sometimes it can feel like, okay, I'm going to take 3 deep breaths and I should be good to go. When we find that in order to trigger that relaxation response that happens in the body, we need to be doing deep breathing for about 2 to 5 minutes, which is a lot longer than 3 deep breaths. So of course you can set an alarm to do deep abdominal breathing for 2 to 5 minutes. But if you're anything like me, you're going to be looking at the timer the entire time. So I prefer to count the breaths as is recommended in the book. And we count the breaths backwards in sets of 10, from 10 all the way down to 1. So it goes inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, 10. Inhale, exhale, 9, all the way down to 1. And in order to hit that 2 to 5 minutes of deep breathing, could be about 2 to 3 sets of 10. We also find that it's helpful for kind of grounding the mind as well, because it's a lot harder to count down slowly from 10 all the way down to 1 than it is to count upwards. So it's also something to do to ground and focus your mind. Another strategy I really like to use is progressive muscle relaxation. And the idea is the progressive muscle relaxation helps us to target the different muscle groups in our bodies when there might be tension going on that either we might not even be fully aware of or might be difficult to relax. So the idea of progressive muscle relaxation is that we're going to progressively go through the different muscle groups in our bodies and practice relaxation by tensing that muscle group as hard as we can without straining for about 10 seconds, and then we're going to let go right away. Not a progressively slow let go, but let go right away. The idea as to why this helps to promote releasing tension in the muscles is that the idea is when we warm up a muscle, it's a lot easier to stretch and relax that muscle than when the muscle is cold. So if you're anything like me and you're kind of questioning, skeptical, okay, why is it that I would actually be less tense after tensing my muscles? The idea is that when we tense them for 10 seconds and then release them right away, we're essentially warming them up and allowing them to release that tension even more than before we even started that activity. So you can start from your toes all the way to your head. You can start from your head down to your toes. But the idea is to be mindful of the different muscle groups in your body to be able to tense and release right away. Finally, I guess the last one I'll add here is exercise. I know we've heard the benefits of exercise many, many times before, but there are a lot of well-documented benefits for mental health and anxiety and stress in particular when it comes to being able to engage in regular aerobic activity. So the recommendation is aerobic exercise, like more vigorous, right? Like running or brisk walking or cycling outdoors or on a stationary bike or swimming, aerobic dancing, anything that gets your whole body moving and moving more briskly for at least 20 to 30 minutes, at least 4 times a week. Now, you might be saying to yourself, oh, I'm not there yet. You can always start progressively, right? Start with 5 minutes, start with 10 minutes, and slowly build your way up there.
Alyssa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely add some, additional strategies that can be helpful. Grounding techniques are and can be extremely important, especially for like in the moment, really noticing symptoms of distress, and we just kind of need to come back into our bodies. You may have heard this before, but sort of this like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 idea, where we identify 5 things that we can see, 4 things that we can feel, 3 things that we can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. This is like a purposeful activity where you're taking in the details of your surroundings and using your senses, and really tuning in and allowing yourself to kind of get back into a more kind of normal, natural state for you. Things like counting backwards from 100 or from 7. It takes a little bit of concentration. And so you're sort of naturally focusing on something different. Spelling the names of everyone in your family backwards, kind of just going through this process, anything that you can do to sort of take yourself out of, thoughts or even feelings and just kind of coming back into the present. Daniela mentioned exercise, which is something, again, that we all hear. I think another thing that we hear a lot is spending time in nature, kind of making sure that we're getting outside, we're interacting with the environment around us, noticing people who are also out and interacting with our environment, helps decrease kind of those feelings of like isolation and loneliness, which Daniela told us can be extremely impactful for our mental and emotional well-being. Some other things that I like to incorporate could be, gratitude journaling. Writing down 3 things that you're grateful for can help remind you of sort of the full complexity of your life outside of these stressors. And gratitude could look like, these sheets feel really good when I woke up this morning. I'm so thankful to see the sun today. Doesn't have to be big, but just meaningful for you in that moment. And keeping a journal can be extremely helpful, especially for those days where it's hard to find the time or hard to find the things that you are grateful for. You have a whole list of things that you've been grateful for in the past. And so maybe those are spaces that you can lean into when you're having a hard day. Certainly, meditation, sort of mindfulness practices can be extremely helpful. I'll talk about 2 in particular. One, there is a loving kindness meditation where you sort of bring to awareness somebody that you care about. It could be, an aunt that you really respect, a friend that you've known throughout your life. It could even be a pet. And sort of bringing into awareness somebody that you care deeply about and cultivating kindness towards them. And slowly throughout this process, then you kind of include yourself in that circle and, cultivate kindness towards yourself and them. And then the next iteration of that is sort of expanding that circle to include all the people that you interact with, even those that you don't know. Right? Because self-compassion sort of tells us that, again, that common humanity piece, like we all experience suffering, regardless of, what those sources of suffering may be. And kind of using that to, again, just like cultivate, this common humanity and decreasing those feelings of self-isolation. The second meditation that I think can be helpful is sort of this like giving and receiving compassion. I typically take a stance where you place one hand over your heart and one hand over your stomach, and you notice you notice kind of like the texture, like what does your hand feel like sitting on your heart? What does that feel like for your hand to be touching your clothes or perhaps even your skin? Noticing the temperature, noticing the pressure of your hands on your body and your body sort of holding your hands. Noticing how you feel about your heart, about yourself, and how it feels, and then how it feels to be, how you feel about you. And I really like this posture because it's an offering of gentle touch towards yourself. And it's a posture such that not only are you giving yourself compassion, comfort, and care, but you're also receiving it from yourself in that moment. So it kind of takes those ideas of self-compassion and puts it into kind of like a more tangible physical realm. That's kind of what I had for that question too.
Wow, thank you. Those were from both of you just really, really helpful tips and just a really helpful discussion about how we can think about stress maybe differently than we have in the past. We've had a lot of great questions that came in before, and we have a lot of great questions coming in now. So we're just gonna shift a little bit to answer some of these questions more specifically. And if anyone has questions, please submit them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. So to start, do you have any recommendations to overcome performance anxiety and stress from, say, public speaking or performance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly feel for the anxiety that we get when we feel like we're under pressure, or feel like we're being evaluated. There are a couple of approaches that I take there. One is to recognize, like, okay, when you're experiencing this performance anxiety, stress from the public speaking, you're likely also experiencing some physiological responses when you're experiencing that stress. It could be you feel your heart is beating faster, you feel your muscles are getting tense, you can feel like your mouth is going dry, you might feel GI distress. And again, all of those things are meant to be adaptive when we're talking about facing imminent danger. But we find that a lot of the threats that we're facing, especially when it's something like the threat of someone's negative evaluation of us, may require a different kind of approach than if the threat is physical, like a bear attack, where having your muscles tense up and breathing more can be really, really helpful. And so one, I think, is to practice that awareness. Okay, what's going on in my body right now? And then we key into, and how am I experiencing those? What kinds of thoughts are getting triggered as a result? Because sometimes there are the thoughts of, oh, everyone's going to notice that I'm experiencing this anxiety, or people can really tell that my voice is really shaky right now. And we're able to evaluate, well, one, is there a possibility that these things are super noticeable to you because you're the one experiencing them? And they may not be quite as noticeable, not to say that they're completely unnoticeable always, but are they maybe not as noticeable to someone else? And so then we also try to explore, are there any thoughts that say, I can't perform if I'm experiencing this anxiety because I'm going to be too shaky, or I'm going to forget my words, or I'm going to freeze up, or, and then we can try to put some of these beliefs to the test to see, okay, here are our predictions. What really happens, right? What really happens when we try anyway? Is it as bad as we think it's going to be? And what, is it, because sometimes our thinking goes to the catastrophic of like, I'll never get, like, if I fail at this, I'll never get over it. I will never have another chance. I can't even use it as practice. And the second question we ask is, okay, even if it is uncomfortable or it doesn't go totally well, can I tolerate it for the sake of being able to gain experience? Because in some ways, we're not going to be able to get better at performing or public speaking without trying and without making mistakes, trial and error.
Oh, that's really helpful. The next question is how someone could support a spouse that has a lot of stress without taking that stress as their own.
Yeah, so I kind of go back to, I typically put sort of like an umbrella of 5 different sort of ways that we can provide our partner support. There's emotional support, esteem support, informational support, tangible support, and network support, right? And so those are the ways that we can show up for our partners in their time of need. Emotional support can look like talking and listening to somebody, just being there with them, letting them know that things are going to be okay. Informational support, advice giving, thinking about things from a new perspective, things like that. Esteem support, which is, saying things like, you've got this, I believe in you, you can do it. Network support looks like, helping them connect with people in their support network. Network support can also be letting them have space if that's what they need. And then tangible support, of course, is like kind of actively getting in there and kind of either taking over a source of stress, or, maybe doing something that's not something that you typically do within your relationship, to help alleviate some of the burdens on that partner. And so those are some of the 5 things that we can do. But I also think it's really important to empower your partner to ask you for the type of support that you need. We often want to show up and say, oh my gosh, let me help fix this problem. But they may not need that. They really might just need you to kind of sit there and just be with them. And sometimes it's that, sometimes they just, if they want you to just be there with them, something you can say is, oh my gosh, like, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm so thankful that you've told me. I appreciate that you trust me with this. how can I help take care of you? So that's kind of where my mind.
Those are really helpful points. The next question is in a similar lens in about how, or do you have any specific advice or tips for stress management in youth, or maybe if clients you work with, if they're adults, like how they would help the youth in their lives manage stress?
It's a great question. I hear a lot of compassion in that question itself.
So,
I help the people in my life. I think, especially in thinking about the developmental tasks that youth are facing as they're developing, growing up, and that means learning more about themselves, about what their needs are, and learning more about how to meet those needs and how to help others. It's all a learning process, and so I go back to basics in terms of breaking it down with the youth in your life about, okay, what are the needs here, right? What are the needs for sleep, for movement, for connection with others, for hygiene, educational need, right? So, and then eliciting some thinking and exploration about, okay, how do you feel like meeting those needs are going? And it might, this might be kind of a new question that the youth is asking themselves, like the teen or child. And so I think there's a measure of patience here and space to allow them to also think about this for themselves too. And then brainstorming, okay, what is it that I might be needing in order to manage some of this stress? And what are some ways where we can get creative about being able to do some of those things that I need, while also leaving a lot of room for trial and error? Because again, they're still learning about themselves, what their needs are. Some of their needs might be changing rapidly. And so there is a sense of, okay, let's try. And if it doesn't seem to be helping after a while, let's switch gears.
No, that's again really, really helpful. The next couple of questions I'm going to ask them together, they're similar, of any advice you have for approaching someone that causes undue stress in your life, how to approach that in a kind way, or someone asked, like, how do you break negative patterns, maybe with themselves or with other people? So if you could give some advice for those questions.
it's a good question. I'm sort of thinking of how I might respond to that.
I think while you're thinking, Alyssa, I think this question it brings to light some of the complexities that we face in our relationships, because I think a stock answer could just be like boundaries, cut them out of your life, and then that's it. But it's so much more complex than that, because we're often in relationships with people that there might be some difficulties, but we also might want to sustain a relationship with them. And so I think there is a little bit of reflecting on, okay, what specifically is causing the undue stress in my life, or what pattern specifically am I seeing here? Because our first clue might be, oh, I'm feeling bad, I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling guilty. But that's our first clue, and we might not have our finger quite on what exactly is causing that. So there's some reflection on, okay, what is it maybe behaviorally that I'm seeing that I might want to see different, and then that helps us to be able to formulate a way to express our needs in a behavioral way of, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I may need from you, and to be able to express it in that way of, I'm feeling this way, these are some of my needs, and then can we have a conversation about that? Because then that opens the door to having a conversation less adversarially of, well, you did this and I did that, and you did back and forth, to, hey, here's some of the things that I'm feeling, and here's some of the things that I'm thinking, and here are some of the ways that I think you might be able to help me out, and then go from there. I don't know if you have any other ideas, Alyssa.
Yeah, that's sort of kind of what I was thinking as well, right? Like it's our relationships that we have with others are so complex. And so it's maybe hard to kind of provide like a one size fits all answer, but I think it does require, insight with yourself as to what those behaviors are that you'd like to change. And even for yourself, kind of, I heard like getting into maybe breaking negative cycles for myself. And I think the first thing is to take accountability, right, for whatever it is that you're feeling and noticing, having some kindness towards yourself about it, and allowing that to take you to a place of, well, what can I do differently? We all have mechanisms that we use to try to take care of ourselves. And some of them work up until a certain point, and then they aren't working for us anymore. And I think it's okay to say that the ways in which, I was trying to take care of myself in the past, they're no longer working for me. How can we have a conversation about it? So it's identifying those needs and then saying, like, it would be really helpful if we could communicate in this way. What do you think about that? So that might be just kind of my little add-on to what you described, Danielle.
And one last thing that when you reference the question of the negative cycles within ourselves, taking accountability, I go back to that self-compassion piece of making changes hard.
Yes.
It's not easy, and being able to identify what keeps us stuck with compassion, I think, is a really important part to persisting, because it's one thing to try to, complete upheaval, 180 change, and then it's another to keep going. And so we find that, okay, what's like one small change that I can make to disrupt this pattern that I'm in? Sometimes it's like I feel paralyzed, Sunday scaries, and I feel paralyzed, and I'm, all I can do is like watch TV all night. And but then I end up feeling like, oh, I wish I had done something different with my time, right? We can identify like, okay, what's one small way that I can change this? And maybe the next time either I forget or I find it too difficult, but to give ourselves a lot of self-compassion for it. Hey, there are a lot of things that are keeping me stuck. And it's okay not to make the change 100% of the time. But if I do it 2% now and then slowly build up to 5% and then 10 and 20, it's the incremental change. But that's really hard to sustain without self-compassion.
It's really helpful. We had a few follow-up questions to some of the techniques that you were discussing earlier. First one is related to exercises, or exercising, excuse me. Can flexibility exercises be helpful, like aerobic exercises as an example?
I think it certainly can be helpful, and when I'm thinking of flexibility exercises, I'm wondering if we maybe think like yoga potentially. Yoga is great for like mobility and increasing flexibility and strength. And one of the major benefits of yoga is this mindful mind-body connection that can have tremendous impacts on our anxiety. But when it comes to the kind of exercise that I described earlier, it really is about getting the heart rate up and moving the large muscles of our body.
Helpful clarification. The next one, I believe, Alyssa, you were discussing this, the connection with nature, and just how that can be helpful. The question is, what are ways to connect with nature when living in a heavily constructed area or maybe a large city where you don't necessarily have as much access to nature?
Absolutely. And this is, I think, a great question, and one that I am certainly toying with myself. Having moved here, from a place where there was a ton of green space and a lot of trails for hiking around, and now kind of living in the city, you don't see that as often. I go back to those senses. Can you feel the sunlight on your face? What is it like to feel that way? To notice yourself noticing that too. really appreciative of all the beautiful tulips that are out around the city right now. Stopping to smell them, looking at the different colors, noticing, which ones haven't budded yet and which ones are, maybe on their last couple of days, who knows. Getting outside, and even the city, it can be, there's a lot of people around, a lot of car noises, and even just like environmentally, thinking about, some of the things that we could even be inhaling and that sort of thing. But, going into those senses with your noise, like with your hearing, like what can I hear? What are those things that I'm picking up on? Your environment doesn't, just have to be a ton of open space. Our environment is, what it is, and sort of using those senses to just connect with it and take a step towards noticing it. But yeah, so it's a really good question.
Yeah, and I love your answer. Even the tulips, especially here in Chicago, it's always nice when those come out. It just feels like spring and summer are coming. So that's a really great example. We just have a few minutes left, and I know following this, we will be sharing a lot of the resources that you talked about. But if you could just kind of close us out of what kind of a relaxation plan or working with a therapist like might include, or how someone would go about finding that space with the therapist.
Yeah, great question. I think when you first meet with a therapist, it's the first sessions are all about gathering information about your background, your history, what has brought you to therapy in the first place. And that, I think, is really helpful to be able, for at least for the therapist, to be able to gather an understanding of what are some of the major contributors to what's been going on, what you've been feeling, and then from there being able to make an individualized plan that could include a lot of the strategies we've talked about in terms of mindfulness and self-compassion and exercise and deep relaxation, and some of the cognitive and behavioral strategies of being able to explore your thinking and maybe broaden some perspectives or even put some beliefs to the test behaviorally. So that's my take on how a therapist could partner with you in the beginning stages.
That's great. And I guess I would just, add, like, thinking about what's worked for you in the past and what hasn't worked for you in the past, and getting curious about that, right? Did that thing work before, but it didn't work that one time? Does that mean that we throw out that skill or tool, or is it something that maybe we can try again? I think that toolbox analogy is really nice, right? Like, sometimes we need a hammer, sometimes we need a screwdriver. And it's important to, kind of take stock of all of our resources, and figuring out which one's going to be the most helpful in any given situation.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you both, Alyssa and Daniela, for this really, really helpful conversation. And thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. As mentioned, we will be sharing the recording and then also the wonderful list of resources that both Alyssa and Daniela shared. We also have online scheduling available if you are looking for support. And you can scan this QR code here or visit our website at family-institute.org. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.